Hello everyone, peace be with you. Life is full of ups and downs. Some days you feel as though you are flying on cloud nine. Life is good, full of magic and mysteries. Other days you find it difficult to get out of bed, and when your alarm goes off, you pull your blankets up over your head and go back to sleep to avoid facing the world. Some days life feels a little bit easier, a little bit lighter, cheerful and joyful. And other days life is boring, tiring, exhausting and draining. Sometimes life is very hard. Sometimes life stays hard for longer than you had anticipated, longer than you could have imagined. Sometimes the world is much heavier and your heart feels like it's sinking and you so badly want to crawl back into your shell and hide away from the world. Yet somehow you are still supposed to make it through. You're still supposed to go through all of your usual motions with a smile on your face and a sparkle in your eye. You are supposed to show up and be yourself and not let anyone else know that you're having a heavy day. Sometimes you think you need to hide the fact that it feels like the world is pressing down on your shoulders. Some days you might not have anything to say to anyone because your soul is so quiet and your mind is so tired and shattered. At times, if you feel like that, you're not alone. Even some of the great men and women of God has gone through such moments in their lives where they felt like life was too harsh. It was too much for them to go on. And sometimes they even lost the will to live. Today we are reflecting on one such character of the Bible who felt that life was not worth living. In fact, he turns to God and even says, "Lord, take my life." And that person is the great prophet of God, Elijah. We find his story in the first book of Kings, chapter 19. For background, you can also read chapter 18 and 19 and even into 20. But I would like to reflect basically on 1 Kings, chapter 19, verses 4 to 8. The text reads like this: "But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. 'It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors.' Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, 'Get up and eat.' He looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, 'Get up and eat. Otherwise the journey will be too much for you.' They got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. Let us now have a look at the background, why Elijah flees to the wilderness and why he felt like that it was enough and the life was not worth living, and he in a way asks God to take away his life. So what brought him to this point? We find actually in chapter 18 of First Kings a little bit about the background of Elijah, what happens. He in a way has a very wonderful victory against the enemies of God. In chapter 18 we find Elijah called down fire from heaven and God answered his prayer in a very powerful way. And then we find that secondly, Elijah has just defeated the prophets of the Baal, whom Jezebel, the wife of the king, worshipped. And next we see that Elijah prays to God for rain as there was a drought going on. And God answers his prayer and it rains. So Elijah has actually have his prayers answered and has experienced the powerful or the mighty hands of God working for him and defeating his enemies. So what goes wrong? We see that once Elijah defeats the prophets or kills the prophets of Baal, Jezebel, the wife of the king, when she hears this, she sends a message to Prophet Elijah, basically saying, I'll do to you what you have done to my prophets. Basically, I'm going to kill you. Just imagine Elijah has experienced the power of God and has been victorious, and yet just one message from Jezebel shatters his faith, his confidence, and instead of trusting in God again, he actually runs away, and he runs away to the wilderness. He goes on a long journey. He was in Jezreel, and from Jezreel he runs away to Beersheba, and then from there to the wilderness, and where he goes under the broom tree and just lays there and maybe just feels so defeated, so frustrated, so lost, and that's where he actually prays to God to take his life. Elijah, it seems like, loses the will to live. As we read earlier, I read it again, he says, he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. It is enough, Lord. Take my life. What do we find here? We find that Elijah was physically exhausted. He was emotionally shattered. And he was spiritually drained. And I think all those things can happen to all of us in life at certain times, when so much goes on in our lives that we feel physically exhausted, we feel emotionally shattered and broken, and we feel spiritually drained. So what do we need at those moments, and what did Elijah need at that moment? We can surely say that Elijah needed to be renewed physically, emotionally, and spiritually. His mind, his body, and his soul needed refreshing. He needed to be restored, his confidence, his hope, his trust, and his faith needed to be renewed in the power of God. What's interesting is even though Elijah loses the sort of will to live and praise to God, to take his life, and even though he does not pray to God for help, in fact he prays for death. But what we see is actually God has his own plans. And even though he doesn't ask for help, even though he doesn't ask for renewal, for refreshing and restoration, God actually looks after him, and he sends his angel who provides him all that he needs. And the angel comes and tells him, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. It's not just one, I quoted one verse. Actually, this is the second time when the angel comes and offers him the food. The first time when he brings the food, he uses the same words, "Get up and eat." And Elijah eats and drinks and goes to sleep again. But the angel of the Lord comes to him the second time, and then after offering him the food, actually tells him, because he's still got a work to do, he's still got a mission to fulfill, and he's still got God's plan to be accomplished, which God is going to accomplish through Elijah. So what do we learn from Elijah's experience? We learn that it is okay to be wiped out sometimes. It is okay not to always be able to cope, and it is okay not to be superhuman. As I said earlier, life is based on ups and downs, and everyone, all of us, go through those experiences, perhaps experiences like Elijah, where even the very powerful man of God feels at a certain stage in his life that life is not worth living. He loses faith, he loses hope, and he loses the will to live. And yet we find even in those moments, God actually is there to help, to guide, to renew, to strengthen, and to refresh. The two questions I would like to ask you if you're listening to or watching this program, and those two questions basically are: who do you turn to when you are in trouble? Who do you turn to when you find yourself in a mess in life, when nothing seems to work, when there's so much desperation, when there's so much trouble, and when there's no sort of light at the end of the tunnel? What do you do? Who do you turn to? And we find in the passage that we have read, even though Elijah's prayer is one of hopelessness and asking God to take his life, and still in those moments he actually turns to God. And God's knowing everything that Elijah is going through actually provides him what he needs physically, emotionally, and spiritually. And the second question for you to sort of reflect on is, or to think about is, when Elijah is sort of in the wilderness and lost all hope, what do we find? That God sends his angel to look after him. So in our own lives, we find that there's so many people around us. They could be our families, our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors, or sometimes even strangers, when we are in a certain situation of helplessness or hopelessness, and we feel that nothing is working for us. So people do come around and put their arms around us, on our shoulders, give us a hug or give us a word of encouragement and strength, and in a way, similar way, restore us emotionally, physically, and spiritually. So maybe think of the people who act like angels in your lives, and maybe say a little prayer for them and say thank you to them for their presence in your lives. The next thing we find is Elijah then, according to the will of God, after he's been refreshed, renewed, strengthened, and restored, he goes on a journey of 40 days and 40 nights. So after his restoration, God has given him a mission to accomplish. And before that, we see what happens, that Elijah is told to go to Mount Horeb, which is also known as Mount Sinai, where God appeared to Moses, and God will appear to him there. So it's interesting that Elijah was running away from God, and God was running after Elijah. And God met him at the lowest point in his life. God provided him with what he needed at that particular point in his life. And we see in 1 Kings 19, God reveals himself to Elijah in a deeper, powerful, and a wonderful and beautiful way that he had ever seen or experienced before at this low point in his life. If you want to read, you can read in chapter 19 of the first book of Kings, where God reveals himself to Elijah. It says here from verse 11, God said to Elijah, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here?" So God actually reveals himself to Elijah, but he reveals himself to Elijah in a way that probably Elijah would have not expected. And many times, perhaps we wouldn't expect God to reveal himself in that way. There's powerful wind, there's powerful earthquake, there's fire, and those kind of earth-shattering events and ways. And perhaps sometimes we think that God reveals himself in the most powerful, wonderful ways, where everything sort of reveals the glory of God, which of course it does. But sometimes God reveals us, himself to us in ways and in places where we do not expect him to. And here we find that God was in a small, still voice, and Elijah actually recognizes that. He might have expected that God is going to reveal himself very powerfully in the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, and yet God reveals himself in a small, still voice. And Elijah had actually the wisdom and the understanding to recognize God even in that still small voice. So God's presence is always there, and it is for us to recognize him in so many different ways and in different places. what we find is then Elijah, once he's renewed, he's been renewed, and then he's met God. God has spoken to him saying, what are you doing here? There's a mission for you to be accomplished, and there's something that you have to carry on. And we see then Elijah, following this encounter with God, actually goes on a journey, on a mission that God has given to him. And he goes on, and God has told him that he's to anoint 2 kings, and which he does. And then he finds Elisha and calls him to follow him, and Elisha becomes his disciple, and then Elisha carries on the mission of God, following Elijah. So here in this wonderful story, we see that even though Elijah at a particular time in his life felt like everything was lost, nothing was working for him, and he loses the will to live, and yet we find that even at those moments, God never abandoned him. He looked after him, he provided him what he needed, and God walked with him and to fulfill the mission that God had given to him. So what we can learn from this wonderful passage, or just few verses, or the story of Elijah, is that never to lose heart, no matter how difficult life might be. Trust in God, and God will provide, God will renew, God will strengthen, God will restore. For we know, especially from this beautiful verse from prophet Isaiah, that God actually never forgets us, even when we feel that God has abandoned us, forsaken us, and we know that God is still with us. Isaiah chapter 49 verses 15-16 reads like this: But Zion said, the Lord has forsaken me, my Lord has forgotten me. Can a woman forget her nursing child, or show no compassion for the child of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. See, I have inscribed you on the palms of my hands. And that's the promise of God to all of us, to each one of us, that our names are inscribed on the hands of God, and God will never forget us, never abandon us, never forsake us. Even when we feel that there is nothing left in life, God knows there is something, and there is a God's plan for us, as God has had a plan for Elijah to go on the journey of life and to carry on his mission. So does God have his plan and his mission for us all. There's again another wonderful quote that I like. I watched this film Life of Pi a few months ago, and I found this quote really interesting and very encouraging, which says, even when God seemed to have abandoned me, he was watching. Even when he seemed indifferent to my suffering, he was watching. And when I was beyond all hope of saving, he gave me rest. Then he gave me a sign to continue my journey. So, learning from Elijah, never lose heart, never lose hope, never lose the will to live. But pray to God that God will nourish you, feed you, restore you, renew you, and strengthen you to carry on the journey of life and to fulfill the mission and the purpose that God has given to us. May God bless you all.